Hey, welcome to the all fantasy episode of this channel. This week we're going to talk about The Broken Sword by Poul Anderson, a book that I think holds an interesting place in the history of the fantasy genre, especially in this sort of split in the mid 20th century between epic fantasy and sword and sorcery, and the influence it holds over a certain strain of fantasy writers that I think it's a book that's not discussed very much anymore, and we'll talk a little bit about that too. But first things first, before we get into that review and talk about the plot and all this stuff, I wanted to catch you guys up on some of the other fantasy-related shenanigans I've been diving into. Yes, I don't just read crime or litfic or SF, I do read fantasy sometimes. I got something really cool in the mail. I don't know if you guys are familiar at all with The Broken Binding. It's a UK bookstore turned publisher who have the subscription service. They create these sort of high quality hardcovers of specific fantasy and now SF titles that have some kind of an audience. They produce like special editions of like Andy Weir books, and I've even ordered a few from them directly, like the new Malazan hardcovers, as well as they had the Priory of the Orange Tree, if you guys are familiar with that Samantha Shannon book, and as well as the Sun Eater, which is something that I got from them pretty recently. But a lot of their titles are subscription only, and while I have access to the stuff that goes to the general public sale and sort of their interest list sale. The stuff that goes sub only, it almost never hits the general public until like a year later. And every once in a while they'll announce something and I'll be really jealous and really want it. And that's something recently was the Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn books by Tad Williams. I don't know if you've ever heard of these books or not. Some of you probably have if you're fantasy readers. It's a very important series that isn't talked about that often. So this came out in the mid 80s. It's kind of the first like chunky fantasy tome that I think even predates the Wheel of Time to a degree. George R. R. Martin said that this was the series that inspired him to create his own sort of epic length multi-volume fantasy series. And that pulled him from sort of the science fiction and then horror writing cycle that he was in and pulled him directly into becoming just a high fantasy writer instead. It's a series that a lot of my friends dig. I haven't even read yet, so I'm looking forward to doing so. And I thought this was the best way to do it because there weren't really that many great versions out. I have the kind of not so nice trade paperback versions that are large, but they're just sort of bland looking. It's have a sword on the cover. It's not that attractive. So when Broken Binding announced these, I knew instantly I needed to have it. And I belong to a little Facebook group that's a private group where people do sort of buying and selling and trading of these things. And somebody recently got his, didn't want them, and I immediately scooped it up. So let's take a look at them really quick. So I showed you first, the very first volume is the Dragon Bone Chair. Very nice cover. And what a lot of people like about these is that they have the splayed edges. Which is like kind of a faddish thing now in genre literature. I'm not sure when this started, but you got some nice end papers as well here. Can you see them? I can't even tell if you can see them. Jeez Louise. I'm gonna do it without like dropping the book. So you got the nice little end paper. Another one. Wow. They're really attractive volumes, and there's no telling if Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn's ever going to be put out in hardcover again here in the States. It'd be a shame if it never was, but the way genre publishing tends to work is that you don't get deluxe editions of certain series until there is a sort of a public need or demand for them, and that usually comes with adaptation. And a lot of times adaptations don't happen for stuff that's kind of on the fringes of popularity, like Tad Williams or Steven Erikson or somebody else like that. Nice cover there. Got another sword on the spine, on the page edges. And the third volume of this series was called To Green Angel Tower, and it was so thick when it was originally published they had to split it into two volumes. Uh, so this is the first volume, which is Siege, and I love this cover. It's so pretty and just pops, and kind of reminds me of the SF Masterworks edition of Lord Valentine's Castle by Robert Silverberg. I just love a good, colorful castle backdrop, I guess. And again, another sword. The second part of To Green Angel Tower. You can see a big battle scene. Looking forward to finding out what that's all about. And got multiple swords on the sides. Also, I wanted to share that I did finish reading George R.R. Martin's A Clash of Kings. And I should say this is a reread. I read this back when the television show was on. And I loved it back then. I thought it was a very exciting book. But you know, when you're in the midst of a really hyped TV show and you want to know what happens next, everything seems good. I will say this reread did highlight for me one thing that's very clear even early on in A Song of Ice and Fire. And that is that when the sprawl hits for Martin, his writing suffers. I thought that the very first book, A Game of Thrones, was an excellent and still is an excellent fantasy novel. I think it's one of the best epic fantasy novels that's ever been produced, really, in publishing. And I think if it were to be just its own standalone, it would still be perfect. That, you know, the commercial interest pushed these things forward, and you can feel the strain already in this book alone. And I have no doubt that when I start reading A Storm of Swords, A Storm of S-Words, A Storm of Swords, when I start reading that book again, I will probably feel a lot of the same like focus that was apparent in A Game of Thrones. But here, there's just a lot of setup. There's a lot of wandering and meandering. The writing is still wonderful, and there are a lot of moments that still really work. The sprawl that people complain about in the later books, like books 4 and 5, A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, I think it shows up earlier than people think. All right, you waited for it. Here it is. Let's talk about the Broken Sword. First things first, the plot. In medieval Denmark, an elf earl named Emmerich orchestrates a fateful swap, stealing a human infant from a warrior's family and leaving a changeling in its place. The human child, Skaflock, is raised among the elves, while the changeling, Valgard, grows up in the human world, unaware of his true nature. As both young men come of age, they become entangled in an ancient conflict between elves and trolls. Their parallel journeys are complicated by an ancient cursed sword, forbidden love, and the rising tide of Christianity that threatens the old magical world. Against this backdrop, both must confront questions of identity and destiny as their paths inevitably converge. Let's start with talking about a little bit about Poul Anderson. He was mostly known as a science fiction writer for the majority of his career, particularly within what we would call the hard science fiction or hard SF genre or subgenre. This is kind of stuff that focuses less on the soft sciences and more on like hard sciences like engineering, mathematics, and physics. They're not my kind of reads, to be completely honest with you. I'm not someone who kind of zeroes in on books by like Kim Stanley Robinson or even someone who's like more beginner hard SF like Andy Weir. It's just not my sort of bailiwick. I'm really more of a political and social science guy. So the soft sciences are where a lot of my taste lies. So the idea of reading one of his more popular books like Tau Zero, which I think, if I remember right, is about a starship that is going at light speed uncontrollably and the impact that has on its crew, which is a pretty cool idea. I might check it out. I've got the Gollancz Masterworks version of that. That's the kind of stuff that he wrote a lot of, especially as he got into sort of the peak of his career. But unlike a lot of other SF writers who stuck to SF almost primarily, he also wrote a strain of fantasy novels that were very much infused and influenced by his own sort of Northern European background. All of the fantasy novels he wrote had some element of Norse myth involved in them. And The Broken Sword, while probably the most influential, wasn't the only one he wrote. He also wrote books like Three Hearts and Three Lions, which introduced this idea of the law and chaos alignment system that would influence Michael Moorcock as well, and then would become so influential in the Dungeons and Dragons alignment system that is now just like a part of pop culture. You know, you can find people making law and chaos and neutral charts that involve like all kinds of weird things that they might be fans of. So yeah, it has influenced the mainstream to a degree that people don't even realize people don't even know where it came from. But it came from Three Hearts and Three Lions. He wrote other books like The High Crusade, the Hrolf Kraki saga, which I just got a copy of very cheaply over Kindle that I hope to read at some point in my life. But The Broken Sword is probably his most influential book. And that's kind of funny to say for a book that a lot of people have not read or are even aware of. But it is the book that is responsible for a lot of the fantasy that you probably enjoy. It came out the same year as The Fellowship of the Ring in 1954. And there's a story that can be told where you can see sort of the divide between where fantasy was going and where it could have gone. With Lord of the Rings, it's epic fantasy, very Northern European and Christian influenced, of course, as Tolkien was a very good Catholic. And with The Broken Sword, you instead have this sort of strain that leans more towards sword and sorcery, and this idea of sort of the Sturm and Drang of fantasy that would influence people. Like, again, I mentioned Michael Moorcock. It's like a third time I've talked about him, sorry. But he was sort of the main adherent of The Broken Sword over The Lord of the Rings as the go-to fantasy story. He specifically said, and I'm paraphrasing his quote, but he said that The Broken Sword knocked The Lord of the Rings into a cocked hat. I don't know if that's true. I still think I prefer The Lord of the Rings as a sit-down, fully fleshed out read, but knowing what Moorcock's writing was like, I can see why that would be the case. It is a tragic, epical saga that is told in very short form and really has no fuss and no muss, man. I mean, it moves fast and it reads just like one of his Elric tales. But not just influencing Elric, though. If you go and look at the sort of the family tree, as it were, you have The Broken Sword influencing Elric. Elric then influencing people like Carl Edward Wagner and his Kane stories. Both of those guys, of course, being influenced by Anderson, but you have them sort of as the center point for where fantasy could have gone. You have writing like Stephen R. Donaldson's The Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, and then the influence of someone like Glenn Cook's The Black Company, which then gives way to both George R. R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, and then Stephen Erickson's Malazan, and now the writings of like people like Joe Abercrombie. Like, it all comes from some degree or another from Anderson's work, whether it's an admitted influence or not. He really is the godfather of what we would call grimdark fantasy. There's also sort of a cool sort of personal trivia note about Anderson in that he was very good friends with Frank Herbert and Jack Vance. There's all these stories and interviews, especially with Vance, who liked to do a lot of interviews, where he would talk about his friendship with those two guys and how they'd get all their families together and they'd go on boat trips and they would hang out. And it makes you wonder, like, what sort of influence each one had on the other. I mean, Herbert wrote things other than Dune, but he's really only known for the Dune books, and that's kind of where he spent the rest of his career writing once that cash cow was put in place. But Vance wrote a lot of books. Like, he wrote so many, and most of them were science fiction, but his fantasy work was particularly influential, especially in what we call the Dying Earth subgenre, which he kind of created, right? Though that's debatable with Clark Ashton Smith and the like. So anyway, whatever, I digress. But you've got Anderson, who also wrote a lot of influential fantasy, and you just kind of wonder if there were ever notes compared, if they ever read for each other and did any sort of like friendly help as far as editing goes. We'll never know. These guys have all passed now, but I think that's kind of an interesting thing to note, especially as a writer myself who relies on his own friends and their own creativity to help sort of enhance and imbue a lot of better ideas into the work that we're producing. Well, onto the Broken Sword itself, there's a lot that I think is interesting about this work, particularly its themes. There's this idea that I think is particularly pronounced in three key themes. We have fate versus free will, we have nature versus nurture, and then we have the cost of power. Like, this sounds so generic, right? Like, there's so many there's so many fantasy books that really kind of do that now, but in 1954 that was less common, especially with fantasy as not really a marketable genre. I mean, at the time, fantasy works were being published in science fiction magazines. The theme that I think is most interesting of the three is this concept of nature versus nurture. What centers this story, as I discussed in the plot synopsis, is the switching of babies, one human child for a changeling child. And if you're a Hellboy fan, you might think, boy, that sounds kind of familiar. And yeah, the idea of switching children, one for sort of this elven fairy-based child, it does come at least as some level of influence for the classic early Hellboy story, The Corpse, which saw Hellboy investigating that very crime and using a piece of iron, which is a weakness of elves and other fairy creatures or fae creatures in The Broken Sword. This idea that makes you wonder, I lost my train of thought. This idea that Mignola might have been influenced by this work did not escape me as I was reading the early acts of The Broken Sword. I don't know if he's ever admitted to or acknowledged the Poul Anderson influence. Maybe not. I mean, they could be pulling from the very same sort of mythological base that influences this story as well, but it's very similar and it's very interesting. That idea of nature versus nurture being sort of the most interesting theme does ring true. I mean, Skaflock is raised by more noble people than probably his own parents were. And Valgard, who's raised by humans, becomes quite evil. But the question is that his troll side that is influencing that? Or is it because he was raised by pretty bloodthirsty parents like Orm the Strong, who has his own history of demolishing villages and conquering and pillaging and the like? While Skaflock is very noble, he makes some questionable moral choices at times, but he's also raised by people, despite the great crime that influenced that parentage that he found himself within, he still is raised by a more noble people that could have also influenced him to become a better person. So it leaves an open question to the reader. Is it nature or is it nurture that creates our own moral code? And I don't know that Anderson really answers that question, but I think this raises like an interesting debate. And it's something that I think readers can kind of go back and forth on. The other thing is like power and its cost. I'm again, this is like such an ongoing fantasy trope now, but I really like the fact that so much of this story is centered on a cursed sword. So rather than, every fantasy story has like an object that is like the Hujamawatsit that must be like destroyed. This big MacGuffin that is going to curse its wearer. And in this case, it's the wielder who is cursed by the sword that must be bathed in blood regularly. And again, that's another Elric influence. I mean, it almost feels like a proto-Stormbringer. The soul-sucking sword of Elric, well, Tyrfling is the bloody evil sword of Skaflock. And once he has it, it actually influences his personality, and it eventually leads to his own fate, which is destined to him by the Norns, etc., etc., etc. The other really noticeable and notable thing about Broken Sword that I think stuck with me the most is its cosmology overall. It exists in a world where belief structure heightens the strength of a particular pantheon of gods. So this entire war that's occurring between the trolls and the elves, that is the underlying premise by which the kidnapping occurs, is completely unnoticed by the realm of man. And they even in the story, Anderson notes that like when battles are happening, men don't even notice it. It's just all in the background, and there might be some element of malady that potentially befalls a village here or there, but they really don't even recognize that any of this is happening. And in the realms of fairy and in other pantheons, such as when Odin makes his appearance, there were references to the White Christ as Christianity has begun to expand beyond just sort of the cradle of civilization, but right in the Middle East, but right into Europe and through Rome, and now it's made its way to Northern Europe. And that is a pretty fascinating way, I think, to develop a fantasy world that is also, I think, steeped in the traditions of various cultures, especially in that region. It reminds me a little bit, and I'm loath to bring this up, but of the Sandman and even American Gods, which I think share, because Gaiman wrote them, share kind of a similar cosmological background and idea space and belief system, and that beliefs give strength to the gods. And that's why new gods continue to rise, because new things are being worshipped. And I think a lot of that came from Anderson. And I think that's its other sort of lasting influence, though this will be the last time I talk about Neil Gaiman on this channel, for sure. With that said, what did I think of the book itself? Well, Anderson employs a kind of like poetic sort of saga type style, something that's really steeped in like the tradition of Norse myth. And so as you're reading it, you'll note that, like, as I did, that it has sort of a compressed storytelling sense, in that things happen very quickly and there's not a lot of motivational base that drives a lot of these actions. So for example, Anderson will have like a lot of abrupt transitions and a lot of just sort of matter-of-fact descriptions. There's also just like a lot of these and thous and sort of like kennings of and like compound descriptors, things like I'm trying to remember, like wave horse for ship. And the term shield maiden is used a lot. I mean, this is the kind of book that you're getting into when you're reading The Broken Sword. I liked it, and I really appreciated its sort of longer term influence. And I think he's actually very good at describing battles. Like, I think that's where the book shines the most. In that I think a lot of fantasy writers struggle to do that. Even Martin, when I'm talking about A Clash of Kings, the battles in that I think are really boringly described, and I think it's one of his weakest elements as a writer. But I think Anderson does a much better job of it, and maybe that's because it's briefer and shorter, and that makes it just a little easier to bear as somebody that's not that interested in war fiction. But I could see this being a challenge, especially for the reader who's used to longer, more ponderous narratives, especially someone who wants like almost 1,000 pages instead of the 200 that this provides. But for me, I appreciated reading it. I especially like towards the back end where Skafloc and Manannan, Mananan or whatever, who is like this Irish god of the sea, they go to the frost giant realm that I'm not even going to try to pronounce at this point. It's not Svartalheim, I don't think, is it? I think maybe it is. Alfheim is the elves. I think Svartalheim might be the frost giants, or maybe it's Niflheim. I don't know. I can't remember. I forgot my Thor mythos. It's been too long. But when they go, they spend an extensive amount of time there. And there's this one stretch where Anderson like breaks the narrative and specifically says, well, they also do this and this and this and this. Like they battle a giant thing and they do this other impossible mission and they do this other thing, but we don't have time in the narrative to talk about that. And I thought that was kind of fun. In that it is like a tribute to sort of the Herculean storytelling that I used to read as a kid, like all the different labors of Hercules and all of this stuff. Like they're doing bigger things beyond just the story in of itself, but we're focused on just the story. And I just thought that was kind of cute and fun. But there's also a lot of flaws in that approach, and one of the biggest is this moral choice that Scofflock makes with his sister. Now, if you're a reader of more mature fantasy, you'll find that things like incest are kind of common, unfortunately. And that does present itself in this story. But the thing is, the logic behind it doesn't make a lot of sense. They're committing this love affair, but they don't actually know that they are related, despite the fact that Scofflock looks exactly like her own brother Valgard. It doesn't make any sense, despite you might not even know about the switching. But wouldn't it be strange to like have a romance with someone who looks exactly like your brother, whether you thought they were your brother or not? And the book doesn't really have a lot of interest in diving into this and exploring that too much further, other than to use it as sort of an emotional hook throughout, especially the third act, which does work, but I think it is like this nagging flaw that I think really I wish Anderson had ironed out just a little bit more. As far as the score goes, I don't know. I'm going to say 3.5 stars. I think there's a lot I can forgive of Anderson's work here. I think its influence is undeniable. And if you want to know more about the history of fantasy as a genre, it's an important book to read. But if you're looking for just kind of like a specific kind of yarn that you can follow along with, and you want to like live and grow with the characters, if you're that kind of fantasy reader, it may not be for you. But for somebody like me who wishes more fantasy was shorter and really just kind of done in one, this kind of mostly did the trick. And it was just cool to sort of see where fantasy could have gone if Lord of the Rings didn't become this like mega phenomenon in the 1960s when it was reprinted for the American audience and the counterculture discovered it. But hey, it's a cool history lesson nevertheless. Anyway, yeah, that's The Broken Sword. And let me know if you guys have read it. I would love to get your thoughts. And as always, like, comment, subscribe. We'll see you next week. Keep on reading.